Well, grief is an emotion that we all know well, but what if we imagine grief as a lens through which we see our lives? And that's the premise behind the latest gallery on display here at the Martha Street Studios called As the Wind Blew, The Ground Beneath Me, at the water's edge in its path. I'm joined now by the creator of that gallery, Sarah Crawley. Thanks so much for having me in your studio space.
Well, thank you, Nolan, for coming to Martha Street Studio to see the show.
I'm very struck by this title that I had to read just because it's so poetic, and I want to make sure I get all the words right. Where did this title come from, and how does it encapsulate the pieces within the exhibit?
Well, it is a very long title, and as you mentioned, and thank you for your kind words about it, kind of the poetry of the title is direct relation to the bodies of work that are in the show. So the exhibition is actually excerpts from 3 different bodies of work that are all related. So the titles of the bodies of work are The Ground Beneath Me is a body of work that was shot primarily in the forest. At the Water's Edge are the works that were shot along the shoreline. And then In Its Path are lumen prints that were made also at the shoreline. And then the overall, the first line, As the Wind Blew, is the title of the video that's included in the show, but it's also kind of an overall umbrella title for the works. And the works, as you mentioned, are reflecting loss and grief. And excuse me, I certainly recognize that everybody in the world at some point experiences loss of some kind or another, and that so we also all usually at some point in our lives experience grief. So these works were made as my response to my personal loss that I felt and the grief that I felt when my mom passed away.
I see. When that loss occurred, what was your sort of initial creative impulse to say, I need to capture the way in which I see the world, and how do you go about choosing the medium through which to express that grief, or to show how that grief is impacting how you then see the world?
Great question. So I work with, mostly I work with photographic-based materials and equipment. So I consider myself a lens-based artist, but ironically there's no actual lens in any of these works because they are pinhole and lumen printing, which I'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
But so I actually started doing the work that ended up in the gallery here prior to my mom passing. The initial impulse was responding to how vulnerable and fragile she was becoming. So that was the works actually started making these works about 6 months prior to her passing. And I had, previous to making these works, I had made work about 4 years before I made these works. I had been working in pinhole photography quite a bit, and I had done a series of works where I sat on the ground for an extended period of time, and that body of work was concerned with place and the importance of place and where we live and where we grow up. So I already had that kind of methodology from a previous body of work, and when I wanted to start kind of exploring what it meant to become vulnerable, I thought of this idea of, again, being in the landscape and photographing myself over an extended exposure with a pinhole camera. But I wanted to, it was just an impulse. It's often not a very clear idea when a body of work is just starting. It's just an impulse. I wanted to lay on the ground. So it felt different than sitting on the ground. And as soon as I lay on the ground in the woods for these very long exposures, I did feel vulnerable. Like there was a sense of I was eaten by insects. It was very uncomfortable. These were not comfortable things to do. And it became really a way for me to kind of intuitively just respond and think about what was going on with my mom in those moments. Mm-hmm. So I decided that I would continue this kind of ritual. So I would basically find a spot in the woods, and hang pinhole cameras that I had built in the trees above where I would lay down, and then also put some on the ground around me. And then I would lay on the ground for 45 minutes while the camera's exposed.
Wow.
And so it was a really powerful and profound experience to do that. The first time that I did that, I had gone to an art retreat at Clear Lake. So most of the work, the pinhole work, is made at Clear Lake, Manitoba.
Okay, wow.
And the first day I was there, I built 9 cameras and then didn't have an opportunity to test them to make sure they were working. So I simply did these and I did quite a few. I do 2 or 3 a day of these kind of 45-minute long exposures. I'm not knowing whether there would be anything on the film. You know, and,
Wow.
and with alternative photography and pinhole photography and analog, you don't know whether there's anything happening. And with the digital, you
Yeah.
know right away. And there was no dark room where I was, so I just did this, went through this process many times, not knowing whether anything would appear on the film in the cameras. But I realized in that process that it didn't really matter. What was important was what I was doing, that kind of ritual of laying down and slowing down and taking time and thinking. And so I decided to do those for a year. And partway through the year, my mom passed away. So then, you know, they kind of took on a different feeling for me.
Right.
I was in the depths of grief at that point, you
Yeah.
know. And so I continued doing those, and they evolved and changed as I, you know, would sometimes, like when I did them in the winter, there were different vulnerabilities. I was no longer
Sure.
being made vulnerable because there were insects, you know, and spiders
Yeah,
and
you're
things
exposed to
biting
different
me.
elements.
Different elements. It was cold and it was wet. So they evolved, and then what ended up happening I went back to the same spot up near Clear Lake, up at Clear Lake, Manitoba, for 4 years in a row. So the second year, I started in the forest again, and then shifted to the water. So something had kind of drawn me to the edge of the water to work along the shoreline. And so I started doing similar works there, laying down in the water or along the shoreline, standing and sitting. And there were a lot of complications around just the technical stuff of whether I could get interesting images at the shoreline.
Yeah.
So it took me, you know, the first year I was at the shoreline, really nothing worked out. The images just weren't interesting. So then I went back another year, and I had, you know, rebuilt some cameras and built some tripods to work in the water. So it was a matter of revisiting this space and revisiting these rituals, and the imagery changing and shifting as I tried different things.
It's interesting you use the word ritual, because as I look around here, the images take on something of a ritualistic sort of a quality, as I see even images of the ritual of setting up the cameras.
Yes.
and getting everything set up so that you can then partake in the ritual yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
You've talked a little bit about these pinhole cameras. How do you go about building them, and why that sort of medium can capture that lens of grief
Right.
so well?
So that's again a great question. So pinhole photography is interesting because, well, in the way that I use it anyways, I like to build my own cameras. You can also buy pinhole cameras, which is great.
Yeah.
They're really fun to play with. But I like to build them because there's a very large element of chance. There's a lot of places where you can make accidents or have accidents or mistakes can happen.
Right.
So I like letting go of a lot of control with photography, and usually photography is kind of about control. You know, you're usually controlling your shutter speed, you're controlling your aperture, you're controlling how much light is getting into the camera, you're controlling the framing, right? The photographer really controls everything. And then in the darkroom too, if you're a darkroom person, you control everything. I really like letting go of a lot of that control and letting the materials and the equipment have kind of an impact or big influence on what happens, and the process as well. So I really like process. I really like the act of making things and being involved and using my hands. So building pinhole cameras is a way to use my hands in my artistic practice. And the cameras themselves, you know, I will build a different set of cameras depending on what I'm photographing and what materials I want to use. So for this project, I had never worked with 8 by 10 inch sheet film. I had worked with 4 by 5 inch sheet film, but I wanted to work with a really big piece of sheet film. And so I built a whole series of cameras so that they could fit that size of film.
Right.
And sometimes when building a camera, it's really interesting to put something into the camera that's related to the content of the work. So you can be very, very specific. And then, like, you know, like once I start using the cameras and I start to kind of understand what the images might look like that are being made in it,
Yeah.
then you can kind of push that in ways that are interesting. But I find certainly with analog film, and not that this can't be done, like there are other artists who work with digital technologies who are very good at opening things up to chance. I just have a hard time with that with digital technologies.
Sure.
I find it a lot easier with analog technologies to let things happen. And there's things happen that I could not have imagined myself, you know, so they're
Right.
almost like these little gifts.
If you were the one controlling the camera, you wouldn't be able to create the same sorts of things because it's these are images that are sort of beyond what you could plan.
Yes, yeah,
yourself.
exactly, yeah. I would never know that putting a camera on the ground and pointing it at me lying on the ground would create the kind of image, like the kind of mark making on the film. It becomes almost very object-like because the piece of film is an object. It exists in this world, and
Right.
and there's lots of, because of the nature of how I put the film into the cameras and things like that, and I'm not very precious with them in the darkroom. They sometimes have scratches and marks and dents and things that show up as on the prints. So you get I think you get a very visceral feeling from these prints. Yeah.
As I look around, and you've talked a little bit about being in the forest, lying on the forest floor to be with nature and with your grief, and then going to the water to have a similar experience, doing this same ritual in different seasons. How do you think the camera captures, or do you think maybe that the camera captures a different sort of grief through each one of those seasons and settings, or does it capture the same grief on a different backdrop?
That's a good question. It's a hard one, I think, for me to answer because I'm so familiar with the imagery and I'm so familiar with my personal narrative behind the imagery. I think when viewers come to see the work, they don't need to know all that personal narrative. There's certainly some of it in the writing that's available in the gallery, and so a viewer would get a sense of what I was doing, and my artist statement and things like that are online.
Yeah.
But I also feel that I think that's more an answer for the viewers to provide, because I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. One other element of this this exhibit that's quite arresting is the video, which we can hear a little bit of happening right behind this camera.
Yeah.
Right here. Again, I'm struck as I watch it that there is something of it looks like a seaside, I guess a lakeside ritual in which we see a woman in a bathing suit wrapped in plastic, lying down on the sand, surrounded by this contraption made of what looks like tin cans and pots mixed with some 2x4s and some duct tape. What are we looking at?
So that's such a great description. This is what we are looking at, and so the video depicts, like you said, I'm the figure in the video, and I am. There's actually a pinhole exposures being made during this video. So the things that you described as the tin cans or pots, those are some pinhole cameras. So those are 3 that I built, and they are on these kind of pieces of wood that are attached to tripods that are on the shoreline. And in this particular, for this particular series of exposures or set of exposures, I wasn't in the water, as you mentioned. I'm right like at the edge of the water. And so this was actually, I had been, for the 2.5 of my retreats, so, because as I said earlier, I went up to Clear Lake to this same spot 4 years in a row. So for the half of the second year, plus the whole 3rd and 4th year that I was there, and I would go up for about 5 days at a time, I was at that shoreline doing these exposures. So I did many, many, many of these. This was the last time that I lay down to do one. So it was the last day that I was there. I didn't think that, I thought it was like closing. I didn't think I would be back the next year to do this again. So I was pretty certain that this would be the last time I would lay down to make these pinhole images. And it was going to be a half-hour long exposure like all the others. But I decided to document it with a GoPro video camera.
Yeah.
And I had started often I would put a pinhole camera on the shoreline documenting what I was doing. And there are a couple images in the show that show a pinhole version of this same thing. But so for the video, it's actually it's an 11-minute loop in the gallery.
Yeah.
And the footage is maybe about 4 or 5 minutes long. It's a little stretched. But I documented the whole thing. It was the setting up the cameras, putting them in place, and then me stepping in and actually creating the image.
Right.
But the GoPro camera, it was fun to work with because it was an older GoPro camera. It has no viewfinder on the back. It had no viewing screen or anything on the back. You're supposed to connect it to a smartphone to see what you're getting.
Yeah.
I didn't have a smartphone then. So I was just shooting blind with the video the same way I was with the pinhole cameras.
Right.
And so I really liked that. And so the framing and everything for the video was random, just like it was with the pinholes.
Amazing to see how like different sorts of iterations or evolutions of technology can then accomplish the same sorts of goals.
Yeah.
The other thing that's really striking when you walk into the exhibit, you see some, I would hesitate to call them monochrome, but like these images that when you walk in, they are far less colorful. But then as you move past the video into the northern side of the exhibit, you then get these prints that you were talking about earlier, which are a lot more vibrant with these purples and pinks. And as I was looking at them, Sarah, I was wondering if maybe this represents the process of the changing of the lens, or in other words, the processing of grief along the same lines. Although I'm not entirely sure of the chronology about how these were created, but maybe as they were arranged such, it felt like all of a sudden we have this experience of grief as this sort of low emotion, and then suddenly here come the colors again as we come to terms with grief and not move on, but to become more accustomed to that
kind of living with it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and definitely you picked up on that in the way that the works are hung in the gallery. It's not like a strict chronological order, but there's definitely a flow in the gallery, and the prints that are created with the pinhole, the more monochromatic ones, that does kind of start off the series overall. And you're referring to the colorful prints at the north end of the gallery, and they are called lumen prints. And definitely when I moved to the edge of the water to do the pinhole works and spent a lot of time in that space. So it's a really powerful space, I find, like where two elements meet. So we're right at that kind of that line where water is meeting land, and spending time in that space. It's kind of, these in-between spaces where they, I think it just creates a really powerful place with lots of potential. And then when you look at what is at the shoreline, and we're talking about, water and plants and sand and stone, it's so basic to our lives. And so spending time at that water, it also, like at that edge of the water, it also really reminded me how whenever I'm stressed, I go to the water. Like swimming is my thing. My mom and I used to swim all the time.
Wow.
And we spent time at different bodies of water when I was a child growing up. We spent a bit of time at Clear Lake, although that was kind of more connected to where my ancestry comes from. But as a child, we went to Lake Winnipeg a lot, to the south basin of Lake Winnipeg. So I started to really recognize that everything that water has given me, and that being at the shoreline really helped me process the grief that I was feeling with my mom. And so I started experimenting with another process called lumen printing that I had never done before. And you do it outside with UV light. And so actually the later in the same summer that the video was made, I went back to Deep Bay, but to do a residency through Manitoba Arts Council. I went back to Clear Lake, to Deep Bay, to do a residency. And for that project, I was doing these experimental lumens, and I just fell in love with the process and the colors that you can get. So the next year, I made a series of trips up to Lake Winnipeg. I wanted to be in that spot where I had these family kind of memories, where it was really, it was amazing to go back to the exact place that I had spent all this time as a child with my parents at the lake. And then to just experiment with making marks. And I was interested in kind of maybe potentially embedding some script into the works in different ways. And lumen printing is very intuitive. You don't see what you're getting, and those colors are created. It's like black and white photo paper, and you lay objects on top of it to block the light, and that's how you create imagery. So texture, pattern, lines is all just from objects. So I simply went to the shoreline and used what was there: sand, stones, leaves, seeds, plants, and the water itself. And so the colors come from how long you let the paper expose to the light, and then also whether the paper gets wet or not during the process. And I did go into the darkroom and then fix these images, which just means putting them into one chemistry to make it a more permanent color. And it actually shifts to the pink color. So those colors, I didn't know I was getting those colors when I was at the shoreline working. Again, it was just a really beautiful kind of a gift. But once I saw those colors, I really loved them. And so the work for me was, again, just really kind of honoring my mom. Like my mom was an artist herself, and she was a painter and a photographer. She often, her subject was often nature. Her work was maybe a little bit more representational than mine, but she really taught me to appreciate nature and to love nature and to appreciate beauty in maybe unusual places, like to appreciate beautiful things that most people just walk by. Whether it's the line of a crack on the sidewalk that's just really beautiful or something, like frost on the window of your car in the morning that the light is shining through. So being at the shoreline and working in that way with the nature was a way to kind of honor my mom, and work through and still continue to process and be in that place with the water.
Given that your mom was also a visual artist, what do you think that she would say about these works?
Oh, well, I think she would like them. She was always a great supporter of mine with my work. And I think it's amazing that it's really, when you grow up with an artist in the house, like if your parent or an older sibling or something is an artist, you like, certainly my mom took me to a lot of art galleries growing up. And so I think that had a big influence on me, but also I think you realize that it's a possibility, that it's actually a possibility in life to be an artist. Like you can do that. And it is a frightening and hard thing to be, it's kind of scary putting your work up on a wall, especially when it's personal.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But you know what, like we started off at the beginning of this conversation, like everybody in the world experiences loss. And everybody experiences grief in some way or another. So I think as an artist, when you're working with a subject as large as that, lots of people are going to find a way in, to the work. So,
totally. The exhibit is on until April the 17th here at Martha Street Studios. Sarah Crawley, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us more about this amazing, amazing exhibit and for letting us be in your studio today.
Well, thank you so much, Nolan. It was my pleasure, and I'm just thrilled that you've asked me some really interesting questions today, and it was great. Thank you.
Of course.